Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, in for Jason Gale. And I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy at Catholic Studies Academy, and Dr. Robert Gorman, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Texas State University. Today we'll be talking about Dr. Smith's new book, published by Catholic Studies Academy's own imprint, St. John Books, Understanding Modern Political Ideas, a guidebook for Christians and Other Patriots. The book is available on Amazon and on our website, CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Today we'll be doing a deeper dive into the foundational parts of the book, introducing modern political ideas, and in contrast, classical political thought before the modern period. Dr. Smith and Jason Gale had already done a general introduction in a previous podcast. So to get started, Dr. Smith, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think is the central point here in the contrast, say, between modern political ideas and the classical political ideas?
Great, thanks, Rich. So I think that when you're looking at this, and when I'm looking at it, I want to understand, right, modern political ideas. So I want to be able to define them. I want to be able to sort of analyze them, look where they've come from, look at their implications, what do they mean, those sorts of things. But I wanted to do so in a way that is in the light of classical political philosophy. So in that way, this ends up being something of a comparative study, right? Where we're looking at ideas like classical liberalism, progressivism, etc., but through the lens of kind of Aristotelian, Thomist, broadly speaking, political philosophy. I think if you're familiar with modern philosophy at all, one of the things that sort of marks off modern philosophy is, I think from a classical point of view, a departure from, a detachment from being and nature, and a kind of idealism, a kind of skepticism with respect to being that is reflected in the politics, right? And so, whereas in a kind of an Aristotelian and Thomist, again, broadly speaking, tradition, being and nature really set the bounds, right, for politics. They really ground political thought and political activity. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that nature is completely absent, right, from modern political thought, but it certainly gets narrowed down, right? It becomes
and actually, doesn't it in modern political thought increasingly, particularly all the way up until we turn into postmodernism, nature becomes more and more sort of an adversarial concept, right? So I need to find my freedom not within nature, as one would say from a classical point of view, but over against nature, right? Until finally nature becomes a hurdle, right? That I have to climb over.
A hurdle, or almost a mere construct, right? It's nature's just a construct of the most powerful faction within society.
Right. In postmodernism, sure.
That's right. In postmodernism, with Kant and subsequent idealists, right, nature kind of fades into the background as the unknown. Marx brings it back a little bit with the material dialectic, but again, it's nature there isn't really purposeful, except insofar as you have the desire to create and produce, which creates power structures that are rooted in the social relations and the means of production.
Right, and you have chapters that deal with these kinds of issues later in the book.
That's right.
But before we go off into those weeds, right? Yes. I kind of want to, and I love that stuff, but as abhorrent as it may be, but I do really want to kind of get at one of the turning points really in modern philosophy, right? That I don't really see tradition. I don't really see sort of the wisdom of the ages, right, as something that sort of liberates me, right? Frees me
Hmm.
from the futility of having to reinvent everything, right?
Hmm.
Rediscover every truth. But instead, it enriches me, right? And it
Hmm.
gives me guidance, it grounds me, it gives me direction.
Sure.
In the classical period, that's the way we would think of it, right? We would think
Hmm.
that what we've learned from the past is to be cherished and
Hmm.
honored, and it helps me not to make the same mistakes that we've made,
Right, 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 right.
right? I can build on it, but in the
Yeah,
modern period, suddenly I have to do everything myself. I've
that's
got
right.
to.
That's right.
Why don't we talk a little bit about that and how that influences political ideas?
Well, I think, yeah. So, I mean, you can look at it a couple of different ways there, right? You can look at the practice of philosophy itself,
Hmm.
right? The practice of ancient, medieval, Renaissance philosophy, maybe to a lesser degree, but still there, is to look at your predecessors as resources to build upon, right? Not necessarily in a completely uncritical way, but in a way that is constructive, right? Whereas modern philosophers always want to start all over again, every time, right? Everybody's been wrong until now, and now I'm going to restart philosophy. Well, to people in other traditions, the older traditions, that would have been just kind of like foolish, right? To try to start all over again every time. And then you can also look at sort of more narrowly at the recommendations with respect to politics. Um, Custom is something that in classical political theory, it has the force of law, right? The idea of precedent, right? Of ancient usage, right? That there's something, Thomas has a particular explanation of it. He sees it really as a determination of reason by the people over time that this is a good way to proceed, right? I really like that formulation because it attaches tradition to rationality. Um,
Yeah, tradition is rational. It's
that's
not
right.
superstition as it's
That's right.
treated in the modern period.
Right. Right. I
So,
mean, it might have sort of aspects to it that are sort of contingent, right?
mhm.
But it's a tradition within this time and place with this people, right? And so that the traditions that are useful in 13th century France are going to be different than the traditions in, say, 20th century or 21st century America, right? But both, right? Cicero or Thomas would say both should appeal to tradition, right? And see tradition as a source of positive guidance within this time and place, right?
But a tradition, right? The idea of tradition, as understood in the classical period, would provide continuity from one age to another.
Mm-hmm,
Even
mm-hmm,
if the traditions do change, they don't change abruptly, right?
mm-mm,
They're
mm-mm,
not just reinvented.
mm-hmm,
And I want to, so I want to put this contrast between the classical period and really our own postmodern period on the
mm-hmm,
table. And then I want to ask Dr. Gorman to maybe tell us a little bit about how this relates to other cultures, the international scene, since that's your
mm-hmm.
area of specialization. Um, Today, what we see is not tradition in this classical sense, right? With where custom plays a particular role, but there's
Sure.
a different kind of anti-custom. There is
Mm-hmm.
this. It fills a sort of a similar role, but in a violently different direction, and that is the sort of faddishness of
Mm-hmm.
today, the trend, right? The
Mm-hmm.
What you'll find is you'll hear language like he's out of touch um, or tone deaf, right?
Uh-huh.
And the
Right, right,
idea is, well, this is the song we're singing now, right? This is the
right.
thing we're doing today,
Mhm.
which is, and it changes all the time, right? It's constantly sort of,
Mhm.
it's hard to keep up with it, right?
Sure,
What today
sure.
is the thing we're allowed to say, or the gesture
Mhm,
we should be
mhm,
doing, so that we can show ourselves to belong.
mhm.
Um, so, Dr. Gorman, this idea, which is all over contemporary Western society today, what do people around the world think of this? I mean, outside of Western culture, how would they regard this sort of thing?
Well, I think the answer has to be kind of twofold. If you look at those who are avant-garde in other parts of the world,
Right.
including in Africa, I taught a course in African politics, among other things. In Asia, where I lived for a couple of years, those who are avant-garde are just as much into this fashion of the day as progressives in this country. But if you go into the villages and into the little towns, and even sometimes into the shanties of Manila or other third world cities, you're going to find people who are still very much down to earth, and who understand that life is hard, that you have to work, you have to engage in productive work for your family to survive. And most of them are very in touch with their families. They don't want outsiders to be messing with their families,
Right.
which is the constant preoccupation of UN agencies and that kind of thing, is to tell everybody else in the world how they ought to live, or whether they should worship or how they should worship, and those kinds of things. And one of the helpful things, the really helpful things, one of the most sane things a student of political science can do is to begin reading the Greco-Roman classics and then work their way through the Christian tradition, and the kind of the grafting of those two traditions, the Judeo-Christian and the Greco-Roman traditions together, which actually is the source of our Western civilization. And then you begin to appreciate the continuity that Ben was talking about a little bit there before, about how you can, within the broad scope of the realist tradition, classical thought, actually develop it. The Judeo-Christian tradition, of course, develops this in ways that would have been impossible in Greco-Roman times, because they didn't have the Christ event had not taken place. There was no New Testament. Christian culture had not spread across the Roman Empire yet to offer a different vision of the world, and one rooted in a true understanding of the dignity of human persons, not just as an abstract idea, but as the reality of who we are as creatures made in the divine image and likeness, which was a concept absent, of course, in the classical tradition. But the natural law was there. The idea that, I mean, guys like Aristotle and Cicero and others in the Stoic tradition were able to observe patterns of human behavior, our natural inclination to family life.
Right.
Aristotle spends a delightful, sometimes a little bit contradictory time in both the ethics and the politics, teasing out how politics arises from the family.
Right.
Even the types of regimes that you find, for a comparative political scientist, are embedded in the relations that exist between spouses, or between parents and children, or between siblings.
Right.
And there's an understanding that religion emerges from the family life.
Sure.
The role
That's
of
right.
ancestors in fashioning custom and belief.
You see just how much more in touch that is with a view of human nature, right? That's stable, that's ordered, that's purposeful, right? One of the things that I touch on in the introduction of the book, and in other places, bring up over and over again, is that a classical kind of politics, any politics is influenced by a classical vision, is going to be one that has a classical and Christian view of the human person, right? So that you have both, sort of this natural law approach you're talking about, the idea of nature as a given, right? It's not something you invent, right? That nature has purposes built into it, that ignoring that nature, just like, ignore it. Like if you're trying to plant tomato plants, on asphalt, it's not going to work, right?
They learned that in the Seattle autonomous zone.
That's right, exactly.
The idea of even science, I mean, science is unthinkable in virtually every other civilizational system in the world other than the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian tradition, which believes that the world is real and that we as knowing beings seeking truth and with a capacity to understand reality, that it's intelligible, that we can learn
That's
about.
right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there are X and Y chromosomes after all. They're really
Right.
male and female.
We used to know that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so one of the things that I think is really central, right, in the classical understanding of things is, which I think we've lost sight of, and you say so in the book, is the idea of the common good. We might throw out the term today, but I don't think we use it at all in the same way that it was used in the classical period.
Right.
And by classical here, I mean all the way through the Middle Ages.
Right. Sure.
So,
sure.
Tell us a little bit about that idea, how it differs from, say, today's idea of, the thing that benefits everyone in
Right.
some way,
Right.
or, right? Okay.
Yeah, I think that, I at this point, I guess like any time that that's what I wrote my dissertation on and belabored and worked on and had to really, change my mind on and understand more deeply and so forth over really, more than a decade. When I hear the term common good now brought up, by politicians or unfortunately by sometimes in an ecclesial setting, I kind of start to get a little like to shudder a little bit because, I would say the most of the time that it's brought up as if the common good is identical to what utilitarians of the John Stuart Mill type thought, right? That is that it's an aggregate of individual satisfactions or in our own time, an aggregate in the decrease of pain and suffering, individual pain and suffering, right? Now, obviously, in general, abstractly, I should say, we would think, one should decrease individual suffering where possible. But that's not the common good, actually. That's not the political common good.
I think today also it's used, again, in sort of this postmodern time that we're in, right? I think it tends to be used today, if I read things correctly, that as a sort of decree of the majority on what is desirable to them.
Sure.
Right. So what most people want, right, or what the most powerful voices want.
Sure. I mean, and that goes along with general satisfaction or general dissatisfaction.
Right. Except in this particular case, right, they're not really concerned about the extreme dissatisfaction of some, which goes to the cruelty, right, that we often find flowing from progressive movements.
Yeah, I think among political scientists, I wrote a book some years ago for the Society of Catholic Social Scientists that was entitled "Toward the Common Good: A Catholic Critique of the Modern Discipline of Political Science." And one of the things you run into when you read political scientists talking about the common good, they say, it's a smokescreen. There's no such thing as the common good. It's just the interests of the powerful that determine these things.
Right.
And of course, that's a highly positivistic understanding of the world. It's there's no longer any anchor in nature or reality. It's an artificial construct. It results from liberal, starting with Hobbes and Locke, and maybe even going back to Machiavelli, who rejected the idea of any kind of eternal truth and only spoke about effective truth. And
so here's,
at least in the Prince, which is the best known of his works.
So here's how Dr. Smith describes it on page 19 of the book. A common good is a good one in number shared by many. Right. That's a pretty straightforward, I think, way to define it. Lifted probably almost right out of St. Thomas. Right.
That's right. Yeah.
That's really how he would describe it. And then you say, by contrast, an individual good, for example, my health, may only be enjoyed by one directly. Right. That I think that's a pretty clear way to describe it, right? I mean, sure, my mother might delight in my health, right?
Sure.
Because she doesn't want me to be
Mhm.
unhealthy, but
Sure.
my health is actually mine, right?
Mhm.
Not
Mhm.
someone else's.
So like for example, you could say as a father of a family, right? My
Mhm.
health is important to my children in the sense that my health and the continuance of my health allows me to contribute to their good, right?
Mhm.
But the good that they enjoy from my health is not my health, but my provision. Does that make
Right.
sense? Right. So
Yeah.
it's kind of indirect. And so one of the things you have to really work to clarify, I think, in your thinking is there really is a qualitative distinction between a common good and an individual good. And that's a little bit difficult, I think. Even when people talk about the common good, they really just usually mean the multiplication of individual goods,
Yeah.
right?
So this is interesting, right? On the one hand, it isn't virtue is an individual good,
Mhm.
right? In a certain sense.
Yeah, a
Um,
given habit, a particular habit. Yeah.
right. Now it has consequences for the common good, right?
Hmm.
The virtue of the citizenry is a common good.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but so part of individual virtue, though, is my caring for the good of others. Would you agree?
Sure. And that's one of the things that I think is wonderful in the classical tradition that sometimes gets missed out is that my individual good actually includes my greater care for the common good that I share with others, right? And so that there isn't this opposition between altruism and egoism in
Right.
classical thought that you run into in modern thought, right? It's actually my good is being a paterfamilias who cares for the common good of the family, right? Where I put the domestic felicity of the whole family above my particular individual enjoyment of this or that good. And but at the same time, what you're suggesting is my individual good of virtue exists most fully, right? When I am caring for the common good of the family.
That's right. Right.
Right.
I think I mean, in a lot of ways, I remember, and I think Rich, you probably had this experience. Bob, you probably had this experience too. That in a lot of ways, like when I came to Aristotle, like that's one of those things where you're just like, as an undergraduate, at least that's when I had this experience. I was just, oh, like there is a way to try to overcome the egoism versus altruism, right? Dichotomy, right? That we experience in modern thought.
Right. And in Aristotle, the thing that really grabbed me, and it took several readings of him actually for me to begin to understand what he was trying to say. Um, all of us know that we want to be happy,
Hmm.
but we tend to identify happiness under the influence of the Enlightenment
Hmm.
as as more a feeling or a sentiment rather than a state of being.
Correct. Yeah.
And Aristotle is very clear in the ethics,
Hmm.
especially, and then in the politics, that happiness is about our flourishing together, and it's about each of us seeking what is good and
Hmm.
true and beautiful and virtuous. It's
Hmm.
about he wouldn't actually put it quite in the way St. Paul and Jesus do in the gospel. That is,
Sure.
it is in giving that we receive.
Right. Right.
The
Right.
idea that you're not just here for yourself, that you're raised in the heart of a family. That family is embedded in a larger community
Hmm.
that pulls and tugs together in
Sure.
economic life, which incidentally, most modern liberal economists don't even know the etymology of the word.
Right.
Oikos nomia, right? Which is
Uh,
a reference to the household management and household
hmm.
law. The work was done in the family for the good of the
Hmm.
family, but it's enhanced by cooperative means of exchange with your neighbors,
Right. Right.
and that everyone flourishes not only materially, but
Hmm.
in terms of their genuine human good when you're involved in a community,
That's right. That's
family,
the key.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
society, and a polity
Hmm.
where you're working and tugging together.
That's what. Yeah.
So,
That's great. And I think it's exactly right. And one of the things that we have to really correct, right, in modern thinking, right, is what we end up with. See, is is if you have an individualistic account of happiness, right, then either what you have to do is have a competitive view, right? You really it comes down to having a competitive view. And then you have to say, well, either I'm just going to be an egoist and care about my individual good, or what we have to do is maximize or equalize, like in a socialist setting, equalize the individual happiness of everyone. But that's completely to misunderstand the nature of happiness, right? Especially at the civic level, right?
And
where
it typically misunderstands freedom too, because
Mhm.
the freedom is embedded in this natural setting where all of us are seeking happiness.
Right.
All of us are aiming towards what's good,
Hmm.
seeking for truth. We're trying to survive in a difficult world. We're trying to promote security and safety and
Hmm.
all these other goods that we have natural inclinations to.
Hmm.
We also have a natural inclination to freedom.
Right.
But freedom simply lived like an idiot. You could even compare that word to ideology, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
You're in touch with the rest of reality,
Mhm.
right? And that's not true freedom.
Mhm.
You don't flourish in that kind of a setting.
Right.
And so it's learning to live by the norms
Hmm.
and the customs and the conventions of one society, that you actually can, your own individual personality and talent and contribution can become visible.
That's right.
Otherwise,
That's right.
it's hidden from
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually and can make you better, right? The
That's
idea
right.
of perfectionism
Right.
Mhm.
is lost today, because
Mhm.
we have this idea that I could be whatever I want to be, right? And freedom
Right.
is really just succumbing to my own wants,
Right.
rather than in some instances transcending them for the sake of a
That's
higher
right.
good.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
Today, you have the freedom to make your own truth.
yeah,
Mhm.
right, which is absurd. But
Truth.
so I want to talk a little bit about this remark in chapter 1, right at the beginning of chapter 1. Actually, you talk about this idea of the relationship between the person and the community when you say political community perfects man,
Mhm.
right? Which today, now it's funny because you could think, well, that's kind of creepy, right? You might think
Sure.
political community perfects man. I'm thinking, Stalin or something,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
Now, I know that isn't what you mean, right?
Sure.
You
Sure.
go on to say it concentrates resources in a way that makes possible the division of labor, specialization, and diversification of markets.
Mhm.
Still, this sounds kind of clinical, right? I mean, it
Mhm.
sounds sort of like, well, we're trying to produce some efficient machine.
Mhm.
But again, I know that's not what you mean.
Mhm.
So how about if you expound a little bit on this idea? What exactly do you mean when you say that the political community perfects man? I know it has to
Mhm.
do with the idea of the common good.
Sure. And it really then comes down to understanding maybe kind of aspects of happiness
Uh,
and the relationship of happiness to the civic community. Now, one of the things that I think um, Aristotle he kind of hints at this and kind of gets this, but of course, within a Christian perspective, Thomas gets it better and recognizes that, that the civic happiness that is really relevant in political talk, right, is not the ultimate happiness, right? That there's a happiness that goes beyond that. That politics isn't ultimate, but politics is real, and so you need to kind of think about, like, what is the kind of happiness that's operative here, and that's the kind of happiness that we're talking about in terms of perfection or completing man.
mhm.
Man is a rational animal, right? And if you really think about human life, um, a lot of our lives are animal enriched by rationality, but animal, right? So bodily, right? Temporal, right? Think about how much of your day is taken up with things like that are related to shelter, clothing, food, children, marriage, the pursuit of marriage, right? Maintaining relationships that develop out of marriage and extended family, right? When you really start to think about it, you know, although there's a part of the human being that transcends that, that is deeply embedded in what we are as human beings, right? And so there is a kind of perfection that we can attain. By perfection, I don't mean pristineness necessarily, but a kind of completeness and actuality of flourishing, right? That we can achieve that has to do with being rational and bodily
And perfection
and
doesn't here
temporal.
mean self-aggrandizement.
No, yeah, it just means actualization. It just means flourishing, right?
Mm.
So, are you flourishing as a citizen, as a father, as a member of a family, as a son, all those sorts of things? You know, we think about
Yeah.
the relationship as a son to your father after you're an adult, right? Is that something that you're still that's still flourishing, right?
Yeah.
Those sorts of things that makes up so much of human life, right? And Aristotle is sensitive to that, and you know what I think Aristotle and St. Thomas are pushing at here is there is a kind of perfection there, a kind of flourishing, and that flourishing only happens rationally and effectively within a well-ordered political community, right? So that we are in a deficient state, not an evil state, but a deficient state, not a morally evil state, but a deficient state when we're trying to achieve that outside of a well-ordered community, right? Now that doesn't mean we can't achieve it at all, but it does mean that the normative setting, right, for what in the technical language is active acquired happiness, right, the kind of imperfect happiness, the proper setting for that is a decent, at least a decently ordered political community. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be decently ordered. And then we can get into why that's the case, right?
So,
but
yeah,
but that's the assertion. There's a kind of happiness that's only available to us in a decently ordered political community.
Yeah, right.
Now,
So,
Aristotle is also, the important fact is that his politics comes after his ethics. That you can see it in the way the two texts are structured.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the political system itself needs to be reflective of ethical order. That what's constitutes virtue in a person also needs to be reflected in the virtuous laws of the state or the city that helps to fashion the community in light of certain habits that lead to good, to truth, to beauty, and to order, and even to philosophy, which Aristotle said would not be possible in a city that wasn't well ordered.
That's right. That's right.
Political order for there to even be people with enough leisure.
That's right.
To pursue philosophy.
Right.
So I love the way he sees how, in a sense, politics, the political community grows out of, this sense of ethics, which is also tied to family relationships. And so the best political systems are ones where the household, the polis and the oikos, are collaborative with one another, fashion the citizen that can be courageous and just and prudent and temperate, reflecting the cardinal virtues, but then the city's laws need to reflect that as well.
Absolutely.
So I like in Aristotle, in the Chromatian Ethics, it's interesting, right, that he says that ethics is ethics falls under political thought, right? And toward the end of the book, he's dealing with issues like friendship.
Exactly.
So he's orienting ethics toward communal relations.
Right.
But he acknowledges that those friendships are embedded first in the family.
Right.
So that a good government that's monarchy represents a good parent and how they raise a child.
Right.
Or aristocracy, the collaborative relationship between husband and wife to raise their children and to provide for the needs of the household.
So yeah, and I want to talk about this idea here in Aristotle, which I find fascinating. I've found a way, I think, to sort of talk about it, right? Because I think it's hard for contemporary people to understand. There's a close relationship in classical thinking between natural goodness and moral goodness. Today, we tend to think of them as being sort of two completely different things.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason we want to do that is because maybe we want to recognize that sometimes morally bad people can be physically excellent or something, right? They can be in very good health, or people in very bad health can be morally excellent. But still, I think that in classical thinking, there's a morality is part of human nature, right? Your character is part of human nature.
Right.
And so the question, right, that we're asking, both in the case of my physical health, but also in the case of my moral health and spiritual health, is, am I a good instantiation? Am I a good example of a human being?
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So when we
Yes.
say,
Yes.
when I ask, are you a good person? And I mean that morally, right? I'm asking whether you are a good example of a human being in terms of character and conduct.
Yeah, that presupposes, right, and I think this is a key difference between classical politics and modern politics. It presupposes that there is a criterion, right, such that one can be measured against it as a good or bad human being.
Yes.
Right. And I think that, again, I don't want to be overly dramatic about it because I think this kind of develops in stages. I think, in my own reading of John Locke, for example, my understanding of him has developed and matured, over the 30 years I've been reading him now. I think he does actually, Locke and then somebody later on like Thomas Reed, I think does actually have something like a sense of human nature and human flourishing. He probably disconnects it from politics more than Aristotle would, right? I think that's where the difference is, right? But as we go through modern philosophy, that idea of, and modern political thinking, that idea of there is a human nature, right? That individual humans can be measured against, I think diminishes and becomes more and more attenuated to almost kind of the vanishing point. So that's, I think that's a big part, right, of where, we are politically. One of the areas, and this is kind of a bold assertion, but one of the reasons that I think we should think about modern political ideas in the light of classical philosophy is that for all of its shortcomings, and I will grant that there are shortcomings, the classical philosophers got right that there is, this sounds weird to say, but there is such a thing as a human being, right? And that it's universal. Now, at the same time, I want to insist strongly that human being is differentiated in time and place to some degree and to important degrees. And this is the balance I think you actually find in Aristotle, right? And later thinkers like Edmund Burke, where you recognize like there is a permanent, such a thing as a permanent human nature, a universal human nature. It is mediated through time and place, and we need to be very sensitive to that. And I think the Aristotelian tradition is. But we've left off that pole, right, of that where there's anything sort of permanent. When I was teaching a class, an honors class at a university on the Greeks and the Romans, right? It was a wonderful class. It was kind of one of those interdisciplinary classes on the Greeks and the Romans. Interestingly, about 5 years later, the administrators in all their wisdom decided to get rid of the class. But it was a wonderful class. And the students loved it. The funny thing is the students loved it, right? But I said, one of the themes of the class is going to be, is there such a thing as human nature? Right.
Yeah.
And certainly like Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle and all these people are going to have different views, right, about that. But a common theme, right, is that there is, right, a human nature there. So I think that's an area where, the classics got it right. And so in a way, I think Aristotle with shortcomings, but nevertheless, and Thomas working on Aristotle, is actually telling us about the reality of politics, right? This is the reality of politics, even when we don't recognize it. And that's why I characterize so much of modern thought as ideological, right?
Mhm.
It's a almost avoidance of the reality of the human person.
Yeah, and part of the reality that was understood from the beginning was that we are rational beings, right? We're human beings. That what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom is precisely our rationality.
Right.
Does that oblige us to the truth?
And it does. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
certainly for Aristotle, he would say then that we are naturally truth seekers. The first line in the metaphysics, right? All men desire to know implicitly the truth. And the way he deals with that in the metaphysics is really, it's, for its time, it's actually brilliant. You just look at it, you go, wow, that somebody got so much of this right, so, so in such an ancient time is really quite amazing. It's, for me, Aristotle points to that idea of the connection then. It's not just Aristotle, it's Plato as well. Then reason needs to be to rule over raw emotion and appetite.
Right. Today it's the other way around, isn't it?
Exactly. And you are more like a beast, which is like what much modern thinking about humanity is. When reason is only used as a calculative device to satisfy passion and appetite.
Yeah, and so in contemporary politics, right? Doesn't it seem though that with this term, and it seems this way to me, that with this term, actually, this is something I think Plato would have recognized in the Republic, that that what happens is, on the one hand, we try to maximize the scope of individual human willfulness, right? So I'm just my drives govern me, not my reason, right? So I try to maximize the scope of that, but recognizing that it will have negative implications, right? The control not coming from my reason must come from an external authority, and thus the sort of libertine but nonetheless totalitarian kinds of political organizations that we see in the postmodern period.
Yeah. Well, the good is the object of the will, and the truth is the object of the reason, and reason schools the will into what is truly good.
Yeah. So actually, that's right, and this actually gets to a point that I wanted to address, which has to do with the question of real versus apparent goods. So the idea of the common good, right, involves the recognition of a good that is common to all, right? So it's a single good, as you said, it's a single good shared by many.
Right.
But we can be mistaken about our identification of what's good and bad.
Sure.
Yes, we can.
Sure.
So how do we deal with that? We need a practical way of trying to make sure that we're not misidentifying the good.
So I think when you hear, it's a good question. I would just go back to, so what is the political common good? And when you hear it, I think it's fairly obvious, and it's one of those things, like, it's obvious once you hear it, right? And then you actually see, this is the way we act. That's what I want to say. I mean, the thing that's most compelling, right, about, say the Aristotelian account of ethics or a Thomist account or whatever, is you start looking at it, you're like, oh yeah, that's actually what happens with me, right? This is actually, what we do. So, when you get down to it specifically and concretely, and I try to define this concretely, right, in the text, is that the political common good is the just development, use, and exchange of temporal goods, right? Or to put it in more modern terms, you might say basic goods and services. And so that's what, that is the common good. And you think about it, when we have political arguments, right? What are we arguing about? We're arguing about whether or not a given distribution, a given exchange, a given use of temporal goods, right, in our body politic is just or not, right? And I think that, like even in our own contemporary debates, that's what it's, when we think about, very often in our contemporary debates, individualism versus socialism or something like that, neither of which are totally correct, but some of them are, I guess, more incorrect than others. But the what we're really arguing about is as a body politic, right? At the level of policy and law in our civic life, what is a just arrangement for our exchanges, right? So I think, can we be wrong about that question? Of course, but that's the question we're asking. That's the question. Like the question we're asking is, us as a body politic, how do we come about to have a just development, use, and exchange of temporal goods?
So really, though, what we learn the minute we begin to sort of push on these ideas is that there's layer upon layer of judgment
Sure.
that we have to make, right? What's the good? What's justice?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we could just dig down and down and down. And this is actually one of the important things about custom that you mentioned earlier, and shared concepts, right? Of human nature and purpose and right. So, and all of which is in short supply today.
Right. Yeah. I agree.
Part of it is that today we expect way too much from government.
Sure.
So if you go back and you look at Aristotle's account of why cities, why families become villages and villages become cities, it's because they become more self-sufficient and more secure. And the primary thing that's driving that is security. A family can't protect its members from theft, robbery, rape, all these kinds of things as effectively as a community of families, a village, or even more effectively a city where everyone is throwing their private goods into the common good of the security of the community.
Right.
So you need people who have courage so that they'll actually be willing to sacrifice their life for the defense of the country. You need people who are courageous to be prudent because you don't want them to throw their life away.
Sure.
You need people who are just and moderate and temperate in order for the whole system to work well. But in terms of the provision of the needs, you don't erase the family to achieve that. You allow the families to flourish in cooperative exchange with one another.
That's right.
And they didn't feel like the government had to direct that. And who paid the taxes? Well, there was an expectation that those who were wealthy would provide for a trireme, which would be a liturgy, a public work. For the good of the people. And then you would honor that person and regard a good citizen because they performed the role that they could with the means that they had.
Yeah, you think about who's the greatest person in the city. The greatest person in the city is the magnanimous man, right?
Right.
Who does great works for the public, right? For the civitas or the polis. That's the ideal citizen, the great citizen, right? Who goes above and beyond, right? But I think you're absolutely right. And where then does the magistrate come in? Well, the magistrate comes in most often, right, when injustice arises, right? So you're right. I think Aristotle and Thomas see the parts of the community as the ones who are building up, right, these basic goods and services, right? It's not the magistrate who is building up these goods and services. The magistrate comes in to say, there's been an injustice here, and now this needs to be rectified.
Exactly, and here's why Christianity is so important, because the church in the life of the Christian community and even beyond the Christian community in the early church was all about tending to the health needs, to the food need.
Right, sure.
to the housing of those, under the corporal works of mercy.
Mhm.
So a lively church
Mhm.
working in a community to provide for the needs of the community, especially those most in need, cooperates with the government, right? In a sense that's there simply to take care of security and to get enough taxes to have a justice system and things like that, and maybe some infrastructure projects and so on. But the socioeconomic and cultural life of the community is carried in the Christian vision by the church itself.
Sure.
And virtually every activity for the social and humanitarian good of the people originated with a saint or with the church itself,
Right,
to provide
right.
a common or a public good for people
Mhm.
without the government directing it to do so, but
Yeah,
out of
that's true, because there was that whole sad failure of Julian the Apostate, right? But I
right.
now we're going a little long, so I want to push
Yeah.
towards some final thoughts
Okay.
by addressing two issues. One is the
Okay.
concept of justice, and the other is the idea of the incommensurability of ideas. This is a
Okay.
term you use in the book.
Mhm.
And I think it's apropos to discuss that concept when we discuss the
Sure.
idea of justice, because current ideas of justice versus classical ideas of
Yeah.
justice are a good example of what you mean by
By
incommensurability.
incommensurability. Yeah, right.
So,
Yeah.
so today, when I hear justice, right, I almost cringe at this. I mean,
So
call
sad,
me
right?
a meanie or somebody, but I mean, obviously, I'm pro justice,
Sure.
but I think today, when people use the word justice, they very often mean one of two things which are loosely interrelated,
Okay.
but so loosely as to be almost but clearly they don't have a system worked out here.
Right, right, right.
One is a demand I place on you,
Okay.
right? So when we talk about justice, we're talking about something that I'm demanding something of you, right? And I'm saying that you giving it to me is justice.
You owe me something.
You owe me
Right.
something, right?
Mhm.
Whether or not you took it from me, right? I mean,
That's a key point. Yeah.
yeah. So you just owe me something because
Mhm.
of how my identity or something, right? And it's a condition of equity,
Mhm.
right? Somehow in society.
Yeah.
That's not really the classical concept, though, right? It's not that classical concept has nothing to do with those ideas,
Correct.
but it's a poor representation and
Yeah,
probably
it's a
discontinuous from it.
it's a watered down and kind of misguided and confused interpretation of that. At the base level, the classical understanding is rendering what is due to another. So there are times, for example, in which you can make a demand upon me. I do owe to you the borrowed ladder, right? If I borrowed your ladder, I do owe it to you back, right? Similarly, if you and I agreed that I would cut your grass for $40, I owe you a mowed lawn, and you owe me $40, right? So there is a time where we can say that there's you can put a demand on someone, right? But it's not a demand of absolute equality vis-a-vis society, right? There's just nothing like that has to do with justice.
Well,
Justice is is rendering what is due to another, and and again, if you take the time to go back into the classical tradition, what is due to another is worked out with a great deal of precision and a great deal of nuance, but basically, the idea that I'm owed something simply because I am human, right?
Owed something
Is
by whom, right? So that's a question that never seems to be asked.
Sure, by whom? Yeah.
Who actually
But
owes it to me?
right, that the community
Right.
at large seems to be the idea.
Yeah.
Owes to me something. I think in the classical perspective is largely negative. That is, I owe to all of my fellow citizens, well, the government, the magistrate, right? What does it owe? It owes certain protections, right? It owes protections of life and property and things of that nature, preventing fraud, etc. It does not owe to you, and this sounds harsh, but it's just true if you think about it. Equal outcomes, equal prestige, equal pleasure, equal honor. It doesn't owe any of that to you. Like the magistrate does not owe that to you, and neither do your fellow citizens. What we owe to each other as fellow citizens is that we're all going to strive for the common good, which is that civic life, right? That we share. One of the things I was really interested in when we got into the whole debate about universal healthcare, right, is how often, right, the common good was invoked in that discussion, especially in Catholic circles, with no recognition that health is an individual good, right? Right? Zero, right? Understanding of that. Now, that doesn't mean that justice and healthcare have nothing to do with each other. I wouldn't want to say that, but we need to recognize I am not owed, right, the same necessarily exactly the same healthcare as everyone else, right? Yeah. And the magistrate doesn't have a duty to give me that in terms of equality. What do you want to say, Bob? You want to jump in there?
Yeah, Aristotle's treatment of this question is interesting because he puts it, if you're talking about distributive justice, then
that's right. Yeah.
Then giving equally to equals and unequally to unequals is necessary to avoid conflict.
That's right. That's right.
In fact, it's the common good.
It's unjust. It's unjust to give unequally.
Then he also treats, you mentioned equity earlier, Rich, and for Aristotle, equity comes to play when the magistrate has fashioned a law and that has created a manifest unfairness in a particular case. And then it's the duty of the judge to adjust the law in the mind of the legislature, assuming that the legislature would not have wanted this unanticipated injustice to occur. So you accommodate it, but you don't make that into a universal rule.
Right.
That's what custom is about, the gradual accommodation to making laws more just in the way they apply to the people as a whole.
Right.
So equity is part of the common good. It's what we would demand of the government when there really is a manifest injustice that it's inflicting because of a bad law.
Or a circumstance the law didn't anticipate.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. I think that's good.
So in the case of Obamacare, it had so many manifest bad outcomes for everybody. You couldn't solve it by equity. You have to peel the sucker and write a new law.
That's right.
So talk incommensurability of ideas.
Okay.
Tell me about relate this to this problem.
I think that Bob just brought up the perfect way to put it, and that is that our ideas about justice are so different, right? That justice is difficult for us to use as a concept to adjudicate our differences, right? There's one large part of the population of the United States, and this is true of other Western powers, that believes justice simply means equality, right? It simply means a kind of arithmetical equality of distribution, and almost arithmetical equality of reduction in suffering, right?
Kamala Harris had a political ad just recently, right, in which basically she explicitly said that equity. She used the term equity involves. This means equity is about achieving equal outcomes. She pretty much explicitly said that.
Whereas a classical notion of justice, and it was just perfectly stated there a minute ago, is you should treat equals as equals insofar as they are equals, and you should treat unequals unequally insofar as they are unequal, right? And those, like, if your view is all inequality is bad, right? And you simply cannot
Yeah, you can't engage in that
You
conversation.
can't engage with the person who says, actually, sometimes the just thing is to treat people unequally and differently, right?
Yeah.
And I
People
think
know that
that,
from their natural experience. I
of
mean,
course, they do when they think
raising
about it.
children knows
Okay.
that, you know, the kid playing football in high school is going to get more potatoes on his plate than the third grade that's already a little
No,
too
and no one
Sure.
is really consistent, right? Even
No.
if they do claim to believe in equity, they're not consistent in the way
Mhm.
that they actually engage with other human
Sure.
beings.
Sure. My test
So
case for this when I teach it in class is to say, do all of you think that you should get exactly the same grade?
yeah,
Both the person who turns in nothing and the person who spends 40 hours on his paper.
give one group assignment and you'll find the answer to that as fast as so
That's right.
right.
That's the free rider problem that the public choice
Yeah.
theorists identified.
Right. So
Yeah,
just
very
as a Catholic theologian, right?
good.
My concern here is that we in the church often don't recognize the extent to which language has become incommensurable,
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
right? So that the Catholic Church has a long tradition, a classical tradition of using terms like justice
Mhm.
and the common good, right? And humanity, right? That,
Solidarity.
that
Right.
isn't shared
Mhm.
by our presumed interlocutor.
Right.
We're not
Right.
having the same conversation at
Yeah.
all,
Yeah.
but we can make ourselves feel as if we're covering ground, that we're making progress,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
we're coming to shared insights and agreements. In
Mhm.
fact, that is not true.
That's right. That's absolutely right, Rich. And that's one of the functions, I think, kind of the side functions of the book, right? Is that we bring out, like, when a Marxist says justice and a progressive says justice and a classical liberal says justice, they all mean very different things, right? And what you need to attune your thought to is, what are the differing accounts of justice here, right?
Mhm.
What are the underlying, go back to Plato, the underlying definitions, right, that are at work. And what you find, I think, with all of those modern ideas is that while, they have their moments where they kind of latch on to something correct, they don't have the kind of breadth and depth that the classical ideas have. And they need to be enriched, right, or corrected,
Yeah.
or in some cases entirely refuted by more sort of stable and trustworthy
And this is really
criteria.
the danger, right, in letting ourselves become fixated on, signing common statements, right, with people, the with people outside the faith, right,
Hmm. Hmm.
or even with people of other religions, right?
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
not because we have to be hostile toward them, but just
Sure.
because we have to recognize that we don't use the terms the same way. The
Right.
very same sentence could mean completely different things depending upon how we're defining the terms.
Hmm. Right on. Yeah. I totally agree. Yep.
Well, this was really a great conversation, and
Yeah.
I appreciate Bob. I appreciate your joining us today.
It's
I
been
hope we
my
can have
pleasure.
you
Yeah.
again.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah. Please.
Um,
Yeah. That was a lot of fun.
and Ben, I think your book is a book we need right now. Um,
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Maybe there's enough left of this republic to that it could actually be of some help.
I do hold out a vision of a positive vision towards the end about what we can do as a republic to kind of reform our political life. So there is that there.
All right, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just that I think that basically in this text, I'm using classical ideas to try to understand the modern ideas. Very often, we go around, to go back to the idea of incommensurability, we go around using terms in ways that we don't understand really what we're saying. We make assumptions about the meanings of terms, about justice and injustice, about the common good, about social justice, those sorts of things, right? About happiness, about what is the good, and really, it's incumbent upon us, both as Christians and as informed citizens, to patriots, people who love their country, to try to think these through more carefully, more deeply. I think it's especially incumbent upon people who live in a republic, right? In a republic, we are supposed to, we don't all have to be Thomas Jefferson or that sort of thing, but at the same time, we need to the degree to which we're able, we need to be good thinkers, right? And the health of our republic really depends upon it.
Amen.
So,
Go to Amazon and get the book. You'll be edified.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that saves Ben the need to make the shameless plug himself. And we're very excited to have our first publication too from our new imprint. So that's thanks, Ben, for writing this book.
Sure. It was a lot of fun.
And until next time, thank you for joining us. May God richly bless you.